Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We're very pleased to welcome back Kim Haxton to continue our conversations on connections with connecting to community.
Thank you.
Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're on traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the circle. To everyone participating today, the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you look after yourself. If you need to talk to an elder or a friend, a family member, or a counselor, please don't hesitate to do so. So, introductions. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chewitho First Nation. I'll be facilitating the session today. Other team members in the room but off camera are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Jordan, our assistant coordinator. If you feel so inclined and you're on the Zoom chat box, please feel free to introduce yourself. To kick off the circle, I would like to give a little bit more information about Kim for anybody that wasn't able to participate last time. Kim is the co-founder of IndigenEYEZ and is a Potawatomi. Boom. From the Wissahickon First Nation in Northern Ontario. Kim has a background in wilderness therapy and Aboriginal youth leadership development with degrees in geography and outdoor rec. After 20 years of studying with Indigenous healers from Nepal, Thailand, Peru, Venezuela, Belize, Haiti, am I missing anything? North America?
No, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
I want to omit that.
She's become deeply involved in healing the community and the individual. She has extensive experience in trauma counseling training and applies this knowledge to her work with survivors of trauma both immediate and ancestral. Kim brings a unique perspective to healing, combining both traditional and modern modalities, and she is convinced of the capacity of individuals and communities to enact their own healing through decolonization and reharmonization with nature. So with that, I wanted to welcome everyone to the circle. Let's dive into it.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank you again for hosting us and me and IndigenEYEZ, and I want to welcome everybody to the circle. I want to acknowledge that we're unceded and attested, really important, Musqueam territory. I want to invite everybody who's out in the circles out there, in the ether world, into this. I want to acknowledge all people. I want to acknowledge male-identified people, female-identified people, non-binary people. I want to acknowledge our two spirited brothers and sisters. I also want to acknowledge that everybody, I love my friend Alan Lindley says there's no right way to be an Indian. And so I want to acknowledge everybody coming into the circle, all bodies, all the ones like myself who are juicy like a berry, and all the ones who are strong and built like willow trees, and slim and just everybody. And I'm really grateful to be here again to talk about community. Yeah.
Cool. So I know we had a few points that we wanted to kind of touch on, or that you would like to discuss. Sure. And do we want to start with the exercise, or do we want to jump into the discussion? What are you thinking?
I think we're going to do the discussion, and then we're going to fine point into sort of strength-based learning, because it's a really important piece. We're going to be talking about lateral liberation today. We talk a lot about in our communities lateral violence, and it's interesting because that's the thing that keeps us separated, which is, I'll just start in.
Right.
Anything that's based in shame, blame, guilt, fear keeps us separated from each other. So things like gossip and the things that happen in our community, there's a lot of places where there's a lot of tears in the fabric of our communities. It's interesting because I've been working in communities just recently, and we were talking about why a lot of the statistics haven't changed around people's health and wellness in the communities, even though the past 40 years there's been lots of really amazing programming, and there's lots of amazing program. What is it that is still keeping the statistics extremely high when it comes to suicide, when it comes to lateral violence, and the different things that play out in our communities, addictions, etc., incarceration? And so it's been a really interesting thing looking at that and discussing this with leaders in communities. That's been a really big conversation. And even though there's lots of really progressive programs, I just want to big up all the programs that I'm seeing out there.
For sure.
There's still something which is keeping us, I don't know, isolated or separated or something. You know, I like the whole idea there's no right way to be an Indian. We often get caught in, well, you're light-skinned. Yeah.
Yeah,
You're sun deficient. You're dark-skinned. You speak with an accent. You're a res Indian. You're an urban Indian. You were adopted. You don't have your culture. You're in foster care. All of these things that are ideas and social constructs that keep us separated. And so when we're talking about connecting to community, you know, what does that look like? And so that's been something like, how do we really, in order to make the shifts and change, how do we do that? What does that look like?
Right.
And we know that there's gatherings, there's feasts, there's powwows, there's different places in which we do come together. But there's also something, and I mean, this might be a big meta picture, impossible utopia idea.
Yeah.
But there's a place in which, how do we actually, you know, come together for the bigger picture? You know, because we have become, I'm going to use the word domesticated into, you know, through our own pain. You know, we know that oppressors oppress other people, and we hold that pain. So when we talk about healing the wounds of our ancestors, healing our wounds or doing our healing work, you know, what does that really look like? Because, like I said, the statistics haven't changed.
Yeah.
You know, well, some of them have, but a lot of them haven't. And so it's a really deep place in which we've been holding as IndigenEYEZ of like, what is that change? You know? And again, for those of you who are new into following this, there's 5 things that are universal. They're the 5 universal healing bombs, you know? And it's singing. Every culture in the world has singing. Every culture in the world has dancing. Every culture in the world has storytelling. Every culture in the world has some sort of ceremony or meditation or something like that. And then the 5th one that I think we're all very familiar with is our connection to nature or the natural world. Because that really informs our cultures and who we are as Indigenous people.
Right.
You know? And so there's a piece there. And so I think about that in some of the communities. I see a lot of work being done in the communities around healing and lots of programs, which I think are really good for those people who get to access them. For those who don't access them, you know, like, how do we connect into the people that aren't accessing the programs?
Yeah.
And so some of the things, and I just want to apologize right now if I offend anybody, because I'm probably going to. And so now I can say it. Is that there's I see a lot of the work in the health centers and the health hubs, people and their trainings, and it's amazing. It totally is.
Yeah.
And then at the leadership level, right? There people aren't necessarily doing that inner work. You know,
Yeah.
And I wonder, we had a conversation about that. What does that? Why is that? You know, and I'm like, if your leadership doesn't do their inner work, you know, the community is going to be capped at that leadership. Like, that's the ceiling.
Right.
That's how far people can go.
Right.
And there's lots of amazing leaders. Like, you know, I'm not saying that at all. You know?
No, of course not.
But there's a place in which we see power. Like people don't know how to be in power. We're not taught that. You know? And so we have mimicked, when I say domesticated, we've mimicked a colonial way of, we've been taught by the Indian agents, you know? And so we see those kind of people in power or with that kind of knowledge, and because we're dealing with a systems, it's nested conflict theory is what I'm looking at right now. So there's the self,
What is that?
there's your family, you know, so think of concentric wheels, circles.
Okay.
So you start with the self, and then outside of yourself are the interpersonal relationships that you have with community, your family, and then there's the community, which would be another circle, right? And then out of that you have institutions, and then out of that you have global, and then you have universal. Right. I don't really know what's in the universal, because we haven't, you know, we can only look up at the sky and be like, ooh, ah, you know, with no disrespect to the people whose cultures who come from, you know that they come from the star people. But I want to not frame it in that. I just want to frame it on this level.
Yeah.
Right. And so most people don't know how to deal with power. We're not taught how to deal with power. We're taught how to be in systems, right? So schools, for example, right? As a good one, we're taught this is how we're supposed to be. You know, and this is what you do, and it's good. I mean, it's not it serves a purpose, but then sometimes we're seeing the purpose of what's happening on a global level in our communities, that it's actually not serving a purpose of liberation.
Right.
It's serving a purpose of keeping us in these patterns, you know? And I think through ceremonies, our singing, dancing, those things help us come into something which is greater than, right? So back to the power piece. So power shows up in different places, like financial power. I have all of this. We also have a hoarding problem, right?
Yeah.
Power shows up in I have power over you. There's a talk about the fourfold way by a woman named Angela Zarian, and she talks about the 4 roles, leadership roles in our community. One of them is the healer, and the healer, you know, is the medicine person that guides you for the healing to your own heart for the answer, and you have this understanding, this wisdom, you know.
Yeah.
Another one is the teacher, right? The teacher plants seeds, right? And knows that those seeds might germinate in a moment. You might get that, oh yeah, I get it. But the teacher also understands that some of those lessons might take 20 years. You know, those seeds might germinate much later in a person's life. But the teacher holds the trust that their knowledge is going out in that way. Another one is the visionary, right? They hold the meta picture for, like, you know, 100 years into the future. What are we thinking about? And that's where, you know, when we look at our power structures, we're not planning for 7 generations.
Right.
You know, we're thinking of our own economic development now, and it's short term. It's limited, right? It's limited. The effects are limited, you know, when we bring it to the statistics. And then the 4th one, which is the warrior. And so this is a piece that I think is really important, because this is where the power piece comes forward, right? Is the warrior is like an old warrior, not old school, I don't mean it in tradition, but I mean in what we've learned. Warrior is like, no, you're wrong, no shame, no blame, guilt, you know. And it's a really it's kind of a colonial mindset, right? No. But how do you say no? Like, the next step of the warrior is the no with a hand out yes. So no, that's not okay, but yes, right? No is the lateral violence that we experience in our communities. No, they're this, them, separate, the gossip, those things.
Right.
But the place in which we're coming into, like, the warrior, the no, it's not okay to be taking resources that are killing people, causing cancers, etc., is no. But it's also, okay, then how do we also, not with just the no, but here's another opportunity. So it's a yes and. It's no. What's a no and here's another idea or solution. So we're not feeling this place where we feel isolated from our communities or our families or things like that, right? Make sense?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting one when we look at, we can't control the universe, you know, natural disasters and things like that. That's not really. I mean, although we do have some influence when it comes to climate change and, you know, but when we look at our systems and government, you know, there's an interesting things that are set up there, right? So how do we navigate that in a way that serves the higher good for everybody, you know, in like a democratic process, right? And you could go into different communities and look at, like, you know, the 6 Nations, the Mohawks, and their idea of democratic process is really amazing, right? You know, but do we have spheres of influence? Yeah, thank goodness we do. We have young people educating themselves. We have people educating themselves, walking in right relationship. You know, whether it's through, whether it's healthcare or whether it's like the ministry with children's services. You know, and how are we holding the space to expand to have right relationship? But it's still a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah.
You know, it's not quite. There's something that's not quite working. A la our statistics. So again, I don't want to apologize. I don't want to offend anybody, but we're still navigating this. What we do have spheres of influence is within our community. Are you, as a person who's a public figure, how are you living your life? Because people are looking at you. Young people are looking at you, right? And if you're carrying out systems of oppression, right? We talk about racism. Racism is a systematic exclusion of groups of people from participation within a shared system. As First Nations people, we know that. Prejudice is the narrow-minded opinions that we have about each other. That's different. Right. And we often use the term racism in that way, but it's like, actually it's not. It's prejudice. I have prejudice, right? Yeah. We all have prejudice in some ways because we're making judgments and assumptions, right? But unfortunately, again, because of our wounds, the wounded, like a dog who's been kicked and beaten, and if you're putting a hand out to the dog to pet it, it can't tell whether you're going to hit it or you're going to pet it. So it wants to bite you, right? Yeah. So if you think about us collectively, and when we talk about lateral violence, a lot of us are carrying those wounds in that way, right? Okay. And so when I think about this, I think, okay, we know all about lateral violence, but what does it mean to, and my friend Roop Sadhu coined the phrase, lateral liberation. What does that look like? How can we lift each other up? Because we all, anybody you talk to, doesn't matter who you talk to, we all want change. We all want things to be better. Yeah, on some level. Yeah. On some level, right? Yeah. And we can, so our spheres of influence are probably within our community. It's still tough because you're navigating systems, right? That's the, between our community and, the institutions, that's where, there's that crossover where they have to be responsible to, let's say, technical things, money, right? How do we get money, right? How do we do those things? And they say, oh, we can't do this because, but it's like, I love Shane Point said, leadership is doing what's right from here, right? And that's not how we've been taught, right? Yeah. And so it's a complicated conversation, but I'm just going to keep on going.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So we have our communities, but then we have our families and our friends, and we do have circles of influence there. A lot of us, and I come from a family which has been separated, and there's a lot of like, there's no problems here. Sweep it under the carpet. We're all good, and it's like, this is not good, and I know so many people who live like that, and and I've heard people, in communities, nobody can beat up my brother except for me. So if somebody else beats up my brother, I'm going to get them, but I can beat him up, and those sort of thoughts, which is kind of funny, but it's kind of not actually. Yeah. But we do have circles of influence in our personal relationship, but we definitely have influence on ourselves. Like, we can't always control it. Oh, of course you can't control other people. No. But you can, this place of liberation comes from ourselves. So one of my mentors, Dr. Beth Hedva, she says this. She says, we need to learn to be with ourselves, letting others be with themselves, letting go of the issues that bind us. Right? So it's a really interesting one for anybody who's a parent. That. Even though you want to help your kid grow up to be the best that they can, eventually they get 14 and they're like, crack. Sorry, mom and dad, I know the answer, right? And that young as a parent, how these little beings come out of you, And so there's a place which, okay, this is the term I want to use, is that we live in a culture of make-believe, right? Instead of what's right. Our minds have been saturated with media and the fear, blame, shame, don't do this or those things. When we look at the things that have happened in our communities, like the colonial impacts of the change we're through, and I'm not saying we need to go back to, no. We do need to pick berries. That's the wrong phrase I was going to think about. But we have our impact, right? The impact we're seeing, and now we've got these tools. Like, we're kind of in a very interesting time, I think, that we have all these tools, and we've got people with beautiful minds creating really amazing work. So Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who I talked about in the first one, who talks about neural decolonization, right? That's some of the work we do, right? How do we reset our brain functioning when we've experienced stress and trauma? We're carrying it intergenerationally in our cells, right? That stress and trauma, which creates these cycles which we keep on patterning into.
Yeah.
You know, anger, shame, blame, shame, blame, you know, running away, avoiding, all of those patterns, you know, and those are set through trauma. Okay?
Yeah.
So when we think about that on an individual level, we can definitely work on ourselves. But we live in community, so it's really important. How do we connect our community so that we can all be lifted together? You know? And that's the big question. That's the big question. So when we realize, okay, I think the impact comes from here. The impact comes from not from having hope, but from having action. Right? And that's a really thing we're like, oh, I hope this. And it's like, no. It's the action that we walk with, you know? And the action that we start saying, no, how do we do it in the right way? How do we walk in the right way? You know, without being complicit in perpetuating those other ideologies which keeps us unhealthy and separated. Okay? So I want to go back to lateral violence, you know, because it's something that's a term that's coined that we all know about. And, you know, when I say lateral violence, we're like, yeah, everybody knows lateral violence. But when I say lateral liberation, you know, I watch people, well, what are you talking about now?
Well, I'd never heard the term before.
Okay, and I've heard people talk about lateral kindness, you know, but I'm like, well, kindness is a good thing for sure, but liberation, you know, is the point of making significant changes with ourselves and each other. And that, I think, is a piece within our communities, you know, rather than, you know, oh, it's that family, you know, nepotism. Think of the things that that happen in our community. Nepotism for sure is a huge one, right? Yeah. What else is another one as a?
Yeah, like nepotism is a big one, and all the branching effects of that as well. I would say, like in terms of whether or not that affects our structures or the way that we set up our governing systems in community, or even how that impacts interfamilial relations, you know, in terms of how do we interact with each other and connect in day-to-day stuff as well, like rec programs or
exactly
feasts,
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. So there's a piece around that. So the question is, like, what is that? How do we get communities to come together? You know? And just, by the way, if anybody has any questions out there, please feel free to
I will be checking.
Interject at any moment, because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page.
I was captivated, but I'm watching now.
Cool. Somebody's out there. Hello. So there's a piece that I think is really important, that when we're talking about lateral liberation, and IndigenEYEZ, we use a program which was developed out of the United States with an organization called Pi Global, and is it the IPC? In order to get people to participate in our community, you know, and to get their commitment to coming and showing up, we need to use our imagination, right? So what is going to bring people in? And I don't mean it in a sales pitch, but I mean, what's going to bring people together? You know, and I think about that, and I think about some of the wounds that I've seen and the things that we get righteous about, you know, which I think there's a couple things there. So I'm going to just drop in on the IPC, the imagination, participation, and commitment model. Like, that's what happens for programs, you know. If your program isn't being successful, why? You have to go back to, like, point one, which is imagination. Why is it not being successful? You know, so you got to create something that people want to participate in. Oh, that was really cool. I had this experience. And so then they tell other people, and then people come in, you know, and then once you have that, then you're going to have people participating. You're going to have their commitment and their participation, you know. So it's kind of like an interesting circle, because a lot of times I was just working with another group where they do work in their communities all over the province, and they're like, yeah, but we're having a hard time getting people to show up to our programs. And so I'm like, well, what would it take to make it really cool?
Yeah.
And some of these women were like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, do you know what a hashtag is? And these, some of the women in the community, right, are just like, what are you talking about, hashtag? I'm like, okay, well, talk to your grandchild and ask them what a hashtag is. They'll be able to help you.
Yeah.
But you got to make it hip, And we were laughing because they developed hashtags, and it was really, really fun. And it was really, they're like, oh, I'm really good at this, because it's like one word or two words or three words, and they were quite proud of themselves. And it was really, really fun. They're like, this is cool. I'm like, yeah, this is cool. How do we get people in? So it's like thinking of those ideas which we connect in. We know that laughter is a medicine, that helps us, that has given us resilience, but using the model of creativity, right? You're going to bring people in. So when I think about that in our spheres of influence, right? Again, with power, we don't know how to do power, deal with power.
Well, I find it interesting. We keep kind of coming back to this concept of power and how that plays out in community, whether or not that's through an official position in community governance or what. But because for me, and this is just my perspective, but it feels like a lot of the time. And again, you mentioned this concept of media, right? That we don't know what leadership looks like, or we've become divorced from what leadership looks like for us as communities, because that's going to be distinct from the way it looks in these colonial systems. And then, so we have a generation of individuals that, like you said, that learned from government agents, or look towards these things and other forms of media as as good models of leadership. And I think that it really gets kind of bogged down with colonial goals, I want to say, when we start valuing financial security over the happiness or wellness of communities.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
So
it's a colonial thing. It's a colonial invasion. Quite honestly, it's just of the mind. You know what I'm saying?
Completely.
Yeah.
So last winter, about a year ago, I had the privilege of hanging out with Adam Dick, and he said this. He said, what are the values we bring into our work? And I thought, and as I started reframing that, because again, we've become, what is that? We can use the word respect, but it's not just a word that we put up on the wall with an eagle on it.
Yeah.
It is a way that we embody how we walk, right? And if we're not walking as a leader, in a way that really is showing leadership, not power over, not I am so great, but really, making sure that everybody's coming along, that's a piece, but we don't, it's an interesting thing. So it kind of brings across the concept of generosity. When we think of the concepts of a lot of our cultures and how generosity is, we know that we're generous people. We know we don't need money to be generous, right? When I look at the West Coast system of the potlatch, which is your status is held by how you're taking care of your community, right? Yeah. That's humongous. Yeah. That's a humongous concept rather than, sort of a Western concept. I have all of these things and money and mine. Yeah. And you can have this little bit here because you've been a good boy, right? Yeah. And so when we look at our institutions, which are set up okay, you can have this, instead of allowing back to power, autonomy of First Nations people knowing how they need to, it's our money. Why do we have to ask you for it? Like those things. And you're going to only give, here's a little piece for you. And, it's an interesting thing where I'm like, how do we do that within our programs? How do we do that with ourselves? So the power piece is becoming empowered, right? And last week we were doing a program and we were talking about some of these ideas. And this woman, her last statement, what was your aha moment? And this really tiny woman who never said anything, the whole training, she just went, I realized I've been a victim and I've carried that. And she said, but I'm not a victim. And she said, and she cried. It was beautiful. And she said, and I just realized I don't want to wear that cloak anymore. you know, and so I felt it from her, that empowerment, you know, because that's the piece, because we believe that the power comes this way, right? Do this, do that.
Right.
You know, we don't want to break the rules. Yeah. And I'm not saying break the rules, okay, just please, you know. But understanding is that, you know, what is the strengthening, right? What strengthens our capacity, you know? Okay, so I hope everybody's able to follow.
Yeah.
The things that stop us are our wounds, and this is essential, right? Like I said, our leadership, you know, how do we connect with the communities? Well, we have to do our own work, you know, and I talked about this in the first round. We have to do our own work. And if we're not doing, like me as Kim, if I'm not healing my wounds, you know, the things that are blocking me, my judgments, my assumptions, right? Yeah. Then I'm perpetuating it, because I'm walking through life where I can't trust anybody. And I'm making judgments, you know, anybody who wears glasses, you know, whatever. Thanks. It's not a great example, but, you know, the things that we have, for sure. You know, white people or institutions. I do have prejudice towards institutions, you know, where I'm like, but it's like, wait a second, you know, there's a possibility. And I'm seeing, you know, some of my young friends who are doing their who are going through education, and, you know, one of my friends is a lawyer, is a PhD student, and is challenging Canadian sort of law with traditional Cree knowledge of the plant world. It's revolutionary. Yeah, it is revolutionary, because what does the natural world teach us? That's the place in which we've become disconnected. Even a lot of Indigenous people, we've become disconnected. So again, the 5 bombs that heal, the natural world, right? And those other places, you know, we know that's really important. So with that in mind, you know, when I talk about leadership, how are we embodying those practices? Yeah. Right? Because we know what it feels like after a night of singing and drumming around a fire. We feel amazing. Yeah. We know what it's like when you're bogged up and you jump into the ocean and it's freezing cold and you're like, boom, everything is clear and crystal clear when you come out of it. Or you go into a sweat lodge and you come out and, you know, in the heat where you're like, I want out of here, it's hot, I can't breathe, and you just sit with it, and then you come out and you are, you know, it's just crystal clear. You know, we don't have those practices. You know, what are those practices that we could bring into, you know, so that when you're going to school, right, and you're working and you've got all these things, what helps you be clear? Yeah. So that you can hold all of it. Right? Makes sense?
Yeah, totally.
So I kind of want to get into a little bit of an activity for anybody that's watching, if you're out there. I want to engage people out there. And so what I'm thinking about is we participate in lateral violence all the time with each other, you know, and not all the time, but a lot of times.